You've heard the story 100 times. Brave colonists fought for freedom and beat the British Empire. But what really happened? What small decisions, secret plans, lucky breaks, and terrible mistakes turned a group of farmers and shopkeepers into a new nation? Today we'll walk through it, step by step, and I promise, there are moments you've never been taught in school. Stay with me. Because the moment that changed everything almost didn't happen. Not on a battlefield, but in a ledger. After the 7 Years' War, Britain was buried in debt. The Empire expected the American colonies, who'd benefited from British victory, to help pay. That idea sounds reasonable on paper, but in practice it meant new taxes and new rules that landed on colonists like a storm. First came laws with dry names that ignited fierce anger: the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. Each one was a spark. The colonists called the taxes unfair. They shouted the phrase that would echo through the years: no taxation without representation. Imagine being taxed by a government where you had no vote, no voice, and no one who knew your life. Tensions rose in streets and taverns. Angry pamphlets and newspapers spread like wildfire. Then a single snowball turned into an avalanche: the Boston Massacre. One March night, mobs and soldiers clashed, 5 colonists dead, and suddenly ordinary arguments about taxes became questions of blood and honor. The British reacted with laws meant to punish Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts. That only united the colonies. Men who had argued about trade and local control found themselves asking a darker question. How far would Britain go to control them? Would they accept a parliament that treated them like subjects rather than citizens? The answer, for many, moved from polite protest to preparation for war. And still, most people did not want full independence. Many called for compromise. But when British commanders tried to confiscate hidden weapons in Concord, Massachusetts, an alarm spread across the countryside like a lightning strike. The British are coming. On April 19, 1775, farmers and Minutemen met soldiers at Lexington and Concord. Shots were fired, men died. The revolution that had simmered for years suddenly became real war. Everything after that looked chaotic. Militias poured from small towns. Volunteers joined at the sight of blood. In Boston, patriots and British forces faced off. At Breed's Hill, often called Bunker Hill, the colonists showed they could stand and fight. They lost the hill, but they won something more valuable: proof they could bleed the British and still survive. Then the Continental Congress did something strange but decisive. They appointed a Virginian, George Washington, a man known more for patience than glory, to lead a ragged army. Why Washington? Because he was trusted, because he could hold the fragile coalition of colonies together, and because he carried the respect of both New England and the South. That choice would matter more than most people realized. But 1776 was brutal. The British struck hard at New York. Washington's army was outmaneuvered and forced into a desperate retreat across Manhattan and New Jersey. Morale collapsed. Enlistments expired. The dream of rebellion seemed to be dying. It would have ended right there, if not for a night in December when Washington crossed a frozen river. A cold December night, ice on the river, men cramped in small boats, muskets wrapped tight. The army needed a victory, not just to win battles but to keep its heart. In a daring move, Washington attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton on December 26th. It was small, surgical, brilliant. The victory at Trenton, followed by a surprise at Princeton, revived the cause. Suddenly hope returned, and troops re-enlisted. The revolution was not over, but turning hope into victory required more than courage. The colonists were young, disorganized, and short of everything: money, weapons, trained soldiers. Britain had the best army in the world and a global navy. So how did the Americans survive? There were several secrets. One was patience. Washington avoided suicidal pitched battles where British superiority would crush him. He fought smart. Small engagements, hit-and-run attacks, and retreats that preserved the core of his army. Another secret was foreign help. Without France, the revolution might have been dug into a grave in a single campaign. When British General Burgoyne marched south from Canada in 1777, hoping to split New England from the rest of the colonies, he miscalculated. He assumed loyalists would rally to him and that the colonies would collapse. Instead, he found supply lines stretched thin, miscommunication, and a fierce American resistance. At Saratoga in October 1777, Burgoyne surrendered. That moment changed the war, as meaning It proved the Americans could defeat a major British force in the field. France saw the chance and decided to commit, with money, ships, and soldiers. When a great power chose your side, the balance of the world shifted. But even with allies, the American cause almost collapsed in another kind of battle. The battle for survival. The winter encampment at Valley Forge, 1777 or 1778, is famous for its cold, its hunger, and its despair. Men froze. Disease swept through the huts. Many left. Washington's army looked broken, yet out of that suffering came transformation. Into that bleak winter walked a stern, efficient man from Prussia, Baron von Steuben. He taught soldiers to march, to reload efficiently, to fight as a disciplined unit. Under his training, raw courage became professional force. By spring, Washington's army was not only alive, it was better. Lafayette, the young French aristocrat who adored the American cause, brought energy and diplomacy. The Americans were learning to fight like soldiers, and the war moved south. Britain pivoted tactics. They believed they could rally loyalists in the southern colonies and choke the rebellion by capturing key ports. They took Charleston and dominated much of the coastal south. It looked like the empire had the upper hand. But a new kind of warfare emerged, irregular, relentless, and deeply American. The swamps and forests of the South produced guerrilla leaders like Francis Marion, whose hit-and-run raids made British control costly and exhausting. Another American, Nathaniel Greene, used strategy and local knowledge to twist British columns like a stubborn rope, draining them of resources. The British conquered cities, but they could not tame the countryside. Amid this military story ran quieter, darker stories. The Revolution was also a civil war. Thousands remained loyal to the crown, risking their lives and livelihoods in support of Britain. Families split, neighbors fought neighbors. The British promised freedom to enslaved people who would fight for them, a move that both offered desperate hope to the enslaved and struck fear into slaveholding colonists. Many African Americans joined both sides, seeking freedom in whatever way they could. Women ran farms, ran spy networks, and nursed the wounded. Figures like Deborah Sampson disguised themselves as men and fought. Others like Abigail Adams pressed leaders about rights and the future. These stories complicate the clean picture of heroic rebels and villainous empire. Real people made agonizing choices. Spies and secrets shaped campaigns as much as muskets. Washington ES Intelligence Network, later called the Culper Ring, gathered information about British plans and movements. In an age before radio and instant communication, the right letter delivered at the right time could save a whole army. When Washington learned of plans, he could avoid traps and strike where the enemy was weakest. That quiet war of whispers mattered tremendously. Back in Europe, diplomacy and naval power became decisive. The French Navy, under Admiral de Grasse, arrived in 1781 and blocked the British by sea at a crucial moment. The British had better soldiers, but the British could not easily fight a war across an ocean when their supply lines were constantly harried and when powerful allies closed the sea. At Yorktown, the Americans and French formed a perfect trap. Washington and the French commander Rochambeau marched south to join forces. The French fleet prevented British relief by sea. Cornwallis found himself surrounded at Yorktown, landlocked and outgunned. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered. The world leaned forward. Would Britain fight on or make a deal? Politics in London was complicated. War is expensive and people tire. Pressure from British politicians, combined with military setbacks and the growing cost of empire, pushed the government toward negotiations. 2 years later, in 1783, Britain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris. The world recognized, at least on paper, a new nation. But victory did not mean immediate harmony. Independence solved some problems and created others. The new United States struggled with debt, with how to govern itself, and with questions it hadn't dared to face in wartime. The Articles of Confederation held the states together, but created a weak central government. Money printed for the war was often worthless. The phrase, "not worth a continental," captured the economic chaos. Without strong institutions, the new nation faced the temptation of collapse. And then there is the revolution's deepest contradiction. The war claimed to be about liberty, yet slavery remained deeply embedded. Many enslaved people had hoped that independence would bring freedom. Instead, in most states, slavery continued and would endure for generations, leading to a deeper, bloodier conflict by the next century. Native American nations lost land and autonomy as settlers expanded. Women who had carried homes and communities through the war rarely gained formal political power. The revolution opened the possibility of rights. but delivering those rights to everyone took much longer. So how did a ragged group of colonies beat an empire? It was never a single cause. It was a mixture of resolve, circumstance, foreign help, and British mistakes. Britain's military was superb on the battlefield, but it fought far from home, against people with local knowledge and fierce will. Britain underestimated how stubborn and resourceful the colonists could be. They believed that capturing cities would end the rebellion. They didn't fully grasp the depth of resistance in the countryside and the political cost of prolonged war. And then there were the human stories, the small choices that changed history. A messenger's speedy ride, a commander's refusal to risk a bloody frontal assault, a soldier's decision to stay through winter, an ally's pledge of ships and money. Each created tumbleweed effects that accumulated into victory. The revolution looked messy because it was messy, human, improvisational, fragile. That fragility makes it all the more remarkable that it succeeded. If you're wondering which moments mattered most, here's the truth. There is no single turning point. If you're wondering which moments mattered most, here's the truth. There is no single turning point. Saratoga made foreign allies. Valley Forge tempered an army. Guerrilla warfare in the South bled British strength. Yorktown closed the deal. Each was necessary but none sufficient on its own. Together they formed a chain. And the chain broke British will. Let's not romanticize the outcome. Independence created opportunity for millions and terrible losses for many others. The world felt the shockwaves. France would later explode into its own revolution, Latin American colonies would rise, and ideas of citizenship and sovereignty would ripple across the globe. Yet America's founding carried the seeds of contradictions that would shadow the nation for centuries. Before I tell you the last secret, the one that could change how you think about everything you've just heard, a quick favor. If you love stories that uncover hidden causes and real people behind famous dates, hit subscribe now. That helps bring more history like this to your feed. Okay, the final secret is this. The American Revolution was as much a battle for a story as it was a battle for land. Winning required convincing people, not only soldiers on the field, that a new nation was worth forming. Leaders like Thomas Paine changed minds with words. His pamphlet, Common Sense, ripped away the idea that kings were natural rulers and made independence a visible possibility for ordinary people. The Declaration of Independence, carefully worded and forceful, became a moral claim the new nation could point to. Victories on the field made the claim stick. In the end, the United States was forged out of risk and improvisation, not inevitability. Imagine if Washington had hesitated at Trenton. Imagine if Burgoyne had succeeded. Imagine if the French had refused support. The United States might not exist as we know it. Instead, what we have is the astonishing result of 1,000 choices converging. So what did the revolution actually accomplish? It established a republic built on a written constitution. It spread ideas of liberty and rights, and it set a precedent. Governments could be created by the people and could be dissolved when they failed their people. But it also left unfinished business, inequality, dispossession of native peoples, and the persistence of slavery. The revolution opened a door. Walking through it and making its promises real would take generations. As the last line of this story, remember this. History is not a neat list of dates. It's a living, breathing sequence of choices. Sometimes brave, sometimes cowardly, often messy. The American Revolution was a miracle of human will and also a product of its times. The American Revolution was a miracle of human will and also a product of its times. It left us a nation and a question. How will we, today, honor the promise of liberty while confronting the injustices the revolution did not solve? If you want that next deep dive, the spies who saved Washington, or the secret French plots behind Yorktown, or the untold stories of the black and native people in the revolution, tell me in the comments. I'll make it next. And if you want exactly this kind of long, suspenseful history broken down into gripping, honest stories, subscribe and ring the bell. We publish deep videos like this every week. Thank you for watching.